Working in the field of childcare, how do we balance IT with real play, especially when it's part of the early years outcomes and early years curriculum?
I think it's a very difficult thing. I'm afraid that the educational powers that be, particularly politicians, are as bedazzled by technology as everybody else, and therefore they've just made the automatic assumption that it's the best thing to get started as soon as possible. I think that it's like parents with the cooker. You've obviously got to be making sure children are aware of it and know how to use it. And there is a very, very useful document that was produced by the Alliance for Childhood in America a couple of years ago, which I would recommend. You can find that on the web. It is just trying to find a sensible balance. But I think the main thing would always to me be, in any use of IT in a setting for children under the age of 7, could I do this in real life better? Could I do it in real life? I sometimes go into nurseries and I see children who, the register involves them moving their name across a screen. And I think, but actually, children need to pick things up. Sort of real concrete things are better. So if you were doing that, why not have their name on cards that they can just put into a box? It's doing things in 3 dimensions, an embodied experience for a young child is always going to be better than a 2-dimensional one. So yes, they need to be aware of it. And there are many ways that things like bebops that you can program, and simple ways that children can use it. As I say, I think that's a document like that's a very good way of making decisions.
From what you've talked about, how well do you think the Montessori approach fits in with your personal approach to child development and attitude towards play?
Everything I know about Montessori sort of goes along with what I've learned through reading other developmental psychology. I mean, Montessori was a genius in her way in terms of her use of observation, and being a medical woman, she was trained as a scientist. So she, in many ways, was a precursor of most of the good practice that's available. And I think all the great, there's a book recently been published by David Elkin called Giants of the Nursery, looking at the main people, Froebel, Montessori, Steiner, and so on, and Reggio Emilia, all the different sort of systems, and they all come down to the same basic things, that in those first 7 years, it is bringing up the child, it's helping to raise the child, rather than trying to put things in. Because there's so much that's naturally got to happen if that child is going to carry on being a lifelong learner and thriving in other respects. So yeah, I'm very impressed by everything I know about Montessori education.
I'm wondering what you think, Sue, the best way for people who share your views, could be to influence others on this, because it is, as the sister mentioned, a struggle with making parents understand, with letting other people understand. So what do you think?
We were talking about this earlier, that parents think you're a crank if you don't have a TV or you limit television. It's one of the reasons why I write my books, and whenever I'm invited on media, I go and I say it, because I think if you just keep telling people the medical advice is this, this is what we know from science, then eventually, hopefully, it will get through. And I think that there now is much more recognition among parents about the need to limit it. I think that's actually beginning to dawn on people, but it's going to take a while before that feeds through in a general way.
Yeah. I'm concerned in the Muslim community that people feel, especially having come maybe more recently from developing nations, that they want their child to get ahead, and the way for their child to get ahead is to become an expert in as much technology as possible at as an early age as possible. They don't have any clue that could be harmful for the children. I'm concerned about that.
My answer to parents who say, oh, well, he's got to get started early because it's a technological age, my answer to that is that due to Moore's law, new things are coming on stream all the time, very fast. Anything a child learns under the age of 7 will probably be out of date by the time they're in their teens. So there really is not a huge advantage in getting started early. But there is a huge advantage in spending those 7 years developing self-regulation, resilience, problem-solving skills, creativity, social and communication skills, physical coordination and fitness, all the things that we know will stand them in good stead throughout their lives. I just think we just haven't got to grips with the idea that this stuff's great for grown-ups, but not necessary for children, and very probably not very good for them as well.
We wouldn't be proposing to have them all learn to drive earlier or anything like that. No, no. And there's just not an understanding what's appropriate at different ages. That's
But again, I think to myself, until this century, it's quite normal for children to smoke. In fact, during the time of the Great Plague of London, it was recommended that the school children smoked because they believed it would keep the plague away. So, I mean, it's rather like Ofsted insisting they do IT. But I mean, it's culture. It takes time before we find out that something is not good.
Piece of advice that you could give to parents who feel like socially pressured to educate the children in a formal way?
What if a parent was saying, I think my child needs formal education very young?
No, I feel, as a group, sometimes people get pressured to go the formal route. As an individual, they might not want to go through the formal, but when you become collectively, people
it's the normative
are pushed.
Pressures, isn't it? It's constant,
it's society pressures,
social pressures. I think my first response, if someone said I feel as though I ought to do this because it's what everybody else is doing, my first response would be, how do you actually really feel deep inside? Because most parents I know, when I ask them what they want for their children, they say, I want him to be happy and I want him to be successful. Those two words come up all the time. And I think that we are aware that children's childhood is being squashed out at the moment. People feel that and are worried by it. And I think we've got to sort of just start saying it's okay to think that. Otherwise, I find myself citing research. There's a piece of research done in New Zealand a couple of years ago that looked at children who'd started to learn to read at the age of 5 and another large group that had learned at the age of 7. They looked at them at the age of 11 and there was absolutely no difference in achievement, but the children who'd started at 7 liked reading more and had slightly better comprehension. So there's nothing to gain, but another piece of research, which is quite a startling one, was called the Longevity Project, published by Howard Friedman. It's only about 4 or 5 years ago now. They actually followed a large cohort of middle-class Californians for 80 years. So it's the longest longitudinal study ever of human beings. It had been started by a researcher called Ternan in the early part of the 20th century, and Friedman's researchers picked it up and carried it through. And they published their findings for what led to a healthy and long life. And one of the unexpected findings was that the earlier children started formal education, the less likely it was that they would be do very well educationally, and the more likely it was that they would have negative midlife experiences in terms of both health and relationships, and also, rather horribly, They were more likely to die earlier. So the implication was that there is something about squashing out childhood that really matters. And the researcher Friedman said he was so glad he hadn't pushed to have his children go to school early, because he realised that they need play more than they need to be pushed, and they need friends and outdoors activities more than they need to be in a classroom. So the researchers show it as well.
I remember reading something about saying that children in care in early preschool and early school environment with a lot of children, you could measure the cortisol in their blood, and they had a higher
so that's
level.
Very preschool, very early ones, yeah.
Yeah, so you could measure that they were physically stressed, and I'm just wondering if maybe that exposure, early physical stress to the demands of being in a room with lots of other children that you don't know when you're still too young to be able to cope with it.
There's still. This is a hugely difficult subject because many mothers have to put their children in nursery because they have to work. And nobody wants mums to feel guilty. But some cortisol studies have shown that children, very young children in those circumstances, are under stress, and the stress continues. Obviously, again, anything like that is going to be dependent on the individual's makeup, an individual child's, you know, the 50-50 nature-nurture thing.
Yeah.
So there is not, as far as I know, enough high-end science to be able to pronounce definitely on